Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you very much, Carmen, for your music earlier. It was marvelous. It put me in a very spatial mood. Okay, so if we can dim the lights just for a second, just to get us going. All right. So who knows about this Arecibo message? Nobody. Marvelous. No, you're not the only ones. No extraterrestrials know about it either. This message was beamed to Messier Object 13. That's over 20,000 light years away. And the idea was to transmit a message that would be easily decoded by an extraterrestrial. Okay, so this is essentially a frequency modulated signal that gets shifted by about 10 hertz every 1/10 of a second. So you saw that line widening and then narrowing and widening. The idea is that you're able to interpret that as a binary signal that looks like this. Now, having received that message, the idea was for the extraterrestrials to somehow infer that it was transmitted by an intelligent form of life. Okay, so let's see how let's try. So let's see, you look at that data, you think, I'm going to just plot it as a time series. So we're just plotting zeros and ones over the length of the message, and you look at this and you think, okay, not much obvious structure there. If you do signal analysis, you think you want to distinguish that from noise. And so we do something called Fourier analysis. So we look at the frequency spectrum of the signal. And if you look at the frequency spectrum, it has the characteristics of white noise. Right? It's like rain or wind or the sound of waves. So there's no obvious information present in it. So you might be a little smarter and say, okay, I'm going to count the number of bits. And if you count the number of bits, you get this number, 1,679. What is special about that number, aliens? Huh? It's not prime, it's semi-prime. Okay, it's semi-prime, which means it's the product of two primes. And in fact, yes, indeed, 23 and 73, the 9th and the 12th primes, which also happen to be the 23 Hilbert problems and the number of books in the Bible, right, which I think has extraordinarily deep meaning. And then what you do is you take those two factors and you use them as the coordinates on a rectangular grid. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take that binary signal and we're going to map it onto the rectangle whose x and y coordinates are given by the two prime factors. And you get this. Right. So, I mean, it's actually fascinating. The only thing that you recognize was this, right? Okay. So you're basically, I don't know, like 9/10 extraterrestrial at this point. Okay, so, okay, let's talk about what this is, actually. So, my reaction to that is this, and so, as is yours. But this was, in all seriousness, a message that was transmitted into space to determine whether or not an intelligent extraterrestrial was present that might interpret the message and reply back. The message was created by SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, led by Frank Drake, who created something called the Drake equation, which you might know. When he showed this message to his colleagues at SETI, so that is people who knew Drake, knew SETI, knew human culture, knew human history, knew binary, knew prime numbers, none of them could make fucking head or tails of the message. Right? And to this day, no one can interpret this, the raw signal. Right? So what is the message? And this is brilliant. And it gets to my central conceit, right, which is there is no topic about which we have been more stupid than intelligence. Right? And the more intelligent you become, the more stupid you are about intelligence. You could sort of go home now, because that's the point. That's the whole point. I guess the moral is, how to not be stupid about intelligence. So this is what it means. This is actually just extraordinary. So the top row indicate the numbers 1 and 10 in binary that are labeled. Those are then used to parameterize elements, which then encode formulae for the sugars and bases in the double helix. And so those are essentially the sugars and the nucleotides in the double helix of DNA. Right. And so that's the double helix that's following Watson-Crick complementary base pairing that comes from this, which is us. We live on the 3rd planet from the sun. That's elevated. Right. The message was transmitted by a telescope, the Arecibo telescope, that has a certain diameter given by this binary number. So this is the very best we can do in communicating a message into space about our existence. And it's an interesting test, what is wrong with this, right? And there's a lot you could say. I think we could spend the evening discussing what's wrong with it. Here's just some examples of what's wrong with it. Clearly it depends on perception. And it is, after all, an electromagnetic signal. It's not at all obvious how you should treat the message. We recognized it was binary quite quickly, but then we had to go through various convolutions to find the structure, but that wouldn't be obvious. This is the most absurd part of it, that the visualization somehow encodes something that we know factually about the world that's written in a completely different language: biochemistry, biology, and technology. And this obvious fact. Now, you might say this is absurd. It was a joke that was played by SETI, maybe an experiment to demonstrate the limitations of communicating with an extraterrestrial. But now I want to tell you that this is actually all tests and exams have this character. This is not unique to the Arecibo message. This is an IQ test from the 1920s. There are many such tests, and I'm going to show you some of the questions that you would have to answer to gain entry, I don't know, into a country, or into a university, or into a school, or get a job. Here are the kinds of questions you get asked. Why is beef better food than cabbage? And this one I actually was nice to you because I gave you the right answer. I will not give you the answers to the ensuing questions. That was a fairly easy one. How about this one? If a man who can't swim should fall into a river, he should yell for help and try to scramble out, dive to the bottom and crawl out, or lie on his back and float. I actually can't answer that question. They seem to be equally plausible or equally ridiculous. Okay, how about this one? If you were held up and robbed in a strange city, should you apply to the police for help? Obviously not. Ask the first man you meet for money to get home, or borrow some money at a bank. Okay. So we laugh now, but if I showed you an IQ test that we now give in 100 years in the future, I think you'd laugh equally. And it says something very profound about how we think about intelligence, because it's essentially baselined by contemporary knowledge, and that's one of its deepest flaws. So it's even worse for humans, right? So, you see the joke there? We just did that for ETs. We did it with other humans, and when it comes to animals, we do it in space. Our gold standard for animal intelligence is human. Right? And it should not be. Okay? And so I'm going to talk about briefly an alternative way of thinking about animal communication. I think Ian, my friend Ian Cousin, was here once, spoke to you with holographic fish and all sorts of extraordinary things. But I want to talk about collective intelligence briefly. If I were to analyze a single neuron in your head, it would not be overwhelmingly impressive, right? But you have 86 billion of them that are connected in such a way that you get to be you. And we test you. One possibility, right, is that we're not analyzing the units correctly. So that was that point I made earlier about what are the units. When it comes to ant society, we recognize that we shouldn't be asking ants questions, giving ants IQ tests, but giving the collective an IQ test. And this is a simulation of stigmergy. It's a pattern by which ants forage in an environment by leaving chemical trails, which the other ants follow. Now, I'm going to show you a slightly more complicated species, but where we try to get similar insights to the kinds of insights you get out of studying ants as a collective. But before I do that, I'm going to... Who knows here the game of life? Oh, okay, that's a fair number of you. So what you do is you take a grid, like the one up there, and it's a rule system, and focus on the central square. So you can see if the central square has one neighbor, in the next generation there, the central square dies of loneliness, so it's no longer present. Okay? If it has two neighbors, then in the next generation, the central square is still black, it's still present. So it has companions. If it has four neighbors, it's crowded and dies, right? But if there are three neighbors around that cell, they reproduce to occupy it. So this is called a cellular automaton. It's quite a popular, discrete, spatially extended dynamical system. It's a rule system. And if you just run those rules on a large enough grid, you produce emergent patterns. And there are endless animations online of this. It's quite beautiful. It was invented by a mathematician at Princeton, John Conway, in 1970. But you can take these emergent patterns and you can configure them on an even bigger grid, and you can build computers out of them. So this is a kind of deep point. You have a simple rule system. It produces emergent patterns like this. And you can take those emergent patterns as building blocks to build devices. In this case, a universal Turing machine, a computer. Okay? So I'm going to show you a different approach to this problem with the natural world. So I'm going to show you a brief video here of spider monkeys. This is some work that we did collaboratively. Spider monkeys are New World monkeys. They're very smart. They're the only monkeys with prehensile tails. Here they're feeding on mangoes. They collectively forage in forests, and they follow one another to food sources. So they learn who is trustworthy and reliable to follow in different conditions. So that's what you're seeing. Okay. So what we can do is collect, by various means, largely video with sort of automated annotation of individuals, data that looks a bit like this. So it looks a bit forbidding, but it's not. Each one of these columns is an individual. It's an individual 1, individual 2, 3, and they're color-coded by the group that they're in. Okay? The rows are time. So we're measuring it, let's say, every 10 minutes, which group you're in. And you can see the individuals here, these 4 individuals are in one group, they're in the same group, and then 2 individuals leave. Right? That's a fission. But then you have a case where these 3 individuals join that group. They join the green group. That's a fusion. So you have fission-fusion dynamics in these populations of spider monkeys traveling through canopies. Groups grow and they shrink. So you can do some mathematics with that kind of data, and out of that you extract a circuit. So this is a circuit you know from engineering. It has and NAND and OR and NOT gates, and it's the kind of circuit that's used in a computer. But we can reconstruct from the collective foraging behavior of spider monkeys in forests' social circuits. And they look like this. So it's a circuit, it's not a social network, it's a circuit. The interactions are logical interactions, like ands and nots and ors. And this circuit, I'm going to show you what it does. Take the circuit. This now stands for the population that we studied, right? So what we did is we took the data, we abstracted it into a circuit. That becomes an abstraction for the population itself, and we can now activate the circuit by turning it on, essentially. And the output of that circuit is an emergent computation. Okay, so in the case of the game of life, the computation was not emergent. It was engineered with emergent parts. This is just individuals following each other according to certain rules that collectively produce a circuit that we can now use as a proxy for the population and run it. And this is what you get out. So this is group size, this is time. The black data is the actually observed group sizes through time, and this blue envelope is our 90% estimate of what the groups should do through time based on our circuit. And you can see that we're able to predict to high accuracy the future behavior of the group through an abstraction that's a computational model of the group derived from their history. Okay? The important point here is that there's no monkey in there that knows this. Right? If you gave a test to any individual and asked it, what should you do? It couldn't answer the question. Right? It's by following these local strategic rules that we aggregate that we can see that they're collectively intelligent in a way that you would never observe by giving an individual monkey an IQ test. And what's better is that different conditions produce different circuits. Right? Each circuit is ecologically relevant in a different set of situations, contexts. So you can think of these as skills. Right? Skill A in one environment and skill B in another that collectively constitute what we would call expertise. Right? So expertise is your ability to distinguish or decide between different skill sets. Right? So you play the piano, you play soccer, you play frisbee, and so on. Each of these is a different skill that you can perfect and learn, but you switch between those skills in a context-dependent manner, and we call that expertise. And so, just to be clear, the history of intelligence has basically been individually centric. But actually, it might be the case that for most species on the planet, the right way to give them a test, if you wanted to do such a thing, which I consider stupid in itself, but let's say you did, would be to study the collective. Because perhaps for them, by virtue of their evolution and natural history, that is the right way to interrogate their intelligence. So I want to shift now to another kind of test that everyone in this room is very familiar with, and that's the Turing test. And the original paper in which the Turing test was presented is this paper in 1950 by Alan Turing. And Alan Turing tried to do something quite clever. He said, I'm not going to give you stupid IQ tests about whether beef is better than cabbage, right? Because that's not going to tell me anything. He wasn't aware of this idea that you could study collective intelligence. That's very new. Requires a lot of data and computing power, the kind that he invented, but didn't have access to, before he was killed by the British government, but that's another story. But he said, why not have a conversation with your subject, your test subject? Now, of course, you can only do that with a human. So you can immediately see the limitation of the Turing test. You immediately see the limitation, by the way, of ChatGPT and Claude and all LLMs, because they're essentially, as I'll get to, Turing tests that work with humans as judges. Right? So it doesn't work for a spider monkey, and it certainly doesn't work for an ant. Okay? So immediately, you're in a non-Darwinian universe when you think of intelligence through the lens of Turing tests. Maybe. So that's the idea. And this is my colleague who just passed away, actually, Dan Dennett. I was with him 2 weeks before he died. One of the great philosophers of consciousness and cognition and computation. And he says, the question that Turing posed, can machines think? Turing declared that this question is too meaningless to deserve discussion. Instead of taking sides in debates about how to define these terms, he restricted his attention to a crisply definable task, winning the imitation game. Thank you very much. Very kind of you. Thinking you need a little bit more alcohol or whatever. You need help, in other words. But okay, so that's the idea. And if you think about this for a second, this should be very familiar to you, this idea of an imitation. You have a judge trying to decide through repeated bouts of interaction whether you're intelligent. Well, there's an ancestor to this idea. Anyone want to guess based on that figure? Charles Darwin. Turing tests are actually evolutionary dynamics in disguise. And this is how it works, right? If you think about natural selection, what do? You have organisms. They're being tested by their environment. If they succeed, they tend to out-reproduce those who do not, right? That's the standard childish view of evolution. And, well, in a sense, that's exactly what's happening with the computer, right? It's trying to convince you, the environment, that it's worthy of your attention. And if it passes that test, there'll be ChatGPT 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 until you, as the judge, cannot distinguish between 8 and 9. At that point, there's no further evolution required on the part of the machine because the natural selection process, you, is incapable of making a distinction. So it's a very interesting fact of Turing tests is that they're upper bounded by the stupidity of their judge. Right? It just has to be true. Okay. So this is what a Turing test is, and we've worked, of course, in evolutionary dynamics a long time, so we can think about this world in slightly different terms. So here's a video game. I'm going to show you a video, and I'll show you the limitation of selection which applies to the Turing test. We're asking, this is a game, Evol Pedal. The idea is to put these rigid bodies that have some elasticity in a virtual universe governed by Newton's laws, and the idea is to travel from one side of the screen to the other by sticking these little blocks together. At some point what we'll do is we'll switch the blocks out for a humanoid figure. I'll ask the humanoid figure to get across a flat plane obeying Newton's laws and kinematics. And this is what happens, right? It doesn't look like anything you know, and it doesn't have to. This is a perfectly intelligent way of traveling across space, obeying Newton's laws and according to the kinematic constraints that you impose on the human body. This is what you will look like in about an hour and a half. Okay, here's where you relax the restriction on the joints, turn down the coefficient of friction, and I don't know what happens here at all. But that's the idea. Yeah, it's just kind of eminently watchable. So the point, right, about selection is you just have to follow the rules of the selective agent. It doesn't say you have to behave in a way that's sensible. And so what you get in the natural world is cheating. Right? That's what you do. So these are all liars. I guess this is a phasmid. There's probably a natural historian in here that looks like a leaf. There's a caterpillar that wants to convince you it's a snake. And here's a gecko that wants to convince you it's a leaf in autumn. Right? Because that's what selection does. And so I just want you to understand that this world that you're trying to be convinced is full of intelligent agents like ChatGPT is a world of liars, right? It's a world that is designed to convince you that it's intelligent, okay? So just think about the history of science through the lens of imitation games. It's a little sort of Amsterdam art interlude. So this is the history of physics as if it were played as an imitation game. So here we are. We start with Copernicus cheating Ptolemy. That's what he did. He managed to convince the world that he had a better theory, and we happen to know that what he did is introduced the heliocentric model over the geocentric model. So after Copernicus cheated Ptolemy, Kepler cheated Copernicus, because he had another more convincing model of how the universe worked in terms of elliptic orbits as opposed to circular orbits, but albeit both being heliocentric. Then Newton cheated Kepler with his theory of gravity based on the inverse square law, and then Einstein cheated Newton with his theories of special and general relativity. Now you're looking at this, what are you fucking talking about? That's not what happened. That's not how science advances. That's not how we get smarter about how the universe works. It's not a series of sleights of hand. It's something else. It's not a series of Turing tests. But somehow, we combine all of these frameworks, right? And what we actually do is we solve problems, right? We perfect our solutions and we generalize, we unify, we synthesize. It's a very different perspective on intelligence than you sitting down with ChatGPT-4 and asking it to write code for you, or to summarize a shitty email that, you know, or write a paper that you should have written yourself instead of some kind of banal letter that you were sending off to someone, where everyone knows it was written by ChatGPT-4 because there was something. So that sort of thing. So, okay, so here's Feynman, Richard Feynman, playing the bongo drums. And in the 60s, he wrote these fantastic texts that anyone who studied physics read, called the Lectures on Physics. And this is what he said physics was. He said, the world is something like a great chess game being played by the gods, and we are observers of the game. We do not know what the rules of the game are. All we are allowed to do is watch the playing. Of course, if we watch long enough, we may eventually catch on to a few of the rules. The rules of the game are what we mean by fundamental physics. So here's a Richard Feynman intelligence test for everyone in this room. What do these three things, by the rules of the game principle, have in common? Shout out the magic word. Huh? Decay. Yeah, okay, what's a fancy word for decay in physics? Entropy, yes. A plus. And so there it is. You know, any heat engine has to produce entropy, Clausius, and the entropy is proportional to the number of states of the system, microstates, Boltzmann. All of these things, which don't seem to have anything in common on the surface, right? Aging dogs, weathering in geological environments, the failure of bridges. If we study them as scientists, the first thing we think about is that, at the top, entropy production, right? Even though the particular theories of geomorphology or senescence and so on are quite specific and quite different. But I want to argue that intelligence, as we understand it, is not about faking it with a complicated model of any one of these systems, but actually arriving at a deeper understanding of what lies behind all of them. Okay, that's not a LLM, but we can argue about that. Okay. So now I just want to sort of get into my home stretch here by talking about puzzles a bit. So we've talked about the limitations of tests, like IQ tests, or the Arecibo message, because they're conditioned on assumptions about factual knowledge, right? And one of the very tricky things is, how can I test you in such a way that it's completely agnostic with respect to your culture and history? I mean, that's actually a really hard thing to do, and that's why it's so hard that we've done stupid things. Then you get the Turing test, which is interesting when played against other humans, and it produces very intriguing results, but we've established also that outsourcing intelligence to unreliable judges is also problematic, because they're bounded by the intelligence of the judge, and there's a temptation to cheat. So the other path we can go down is things like puzzles and games. And the idea behind that is that somehow, and although it's often not true, there's something about them that's more universal, that, you know, I can give, as I will in a second, Rubik's cubes to anyone in the world, and their curiosity about them, befuddlement about them, doesn't depend on their nationality or what language they speak or what facts they know about the society, okay? So that's why we've been obsessed with puzzles and games like chess and Go, even though they have their limitations. So I'm talking a little bit about Rubik's Cubes now. So here's a Rubik's Cube. Does everyone know what a Rubik's Cube is? Yes! I mean, not everyone. I mean, you know, they were big in the 70s, and they had a resurgence. And so during COVID, like everyone else here, I was locked at home, completely bored. So I wanted to be an expert on Rubik's Cubes. And so I started doing serious research on Rubik's Cubes, and not just the 3 cube, but all cubes, and I'll talk about that in a second. Well, how is it we solve them? I mean, they're actually kind of extraordinary things. So I'm going to show you a little video from the 1970s when Rubik built it, which has a certain kind of antiquated charm, I think.
There's never been a puzzle quite like Rubik's Cube, and America may never be the same. A medical journal has written about a unique phenomenon, Rubik's Thumb. A museum recognized it as a work of art. Rubik's Cube has been involved in divorce proceedings. People are practicing at clinics, entering contests, and competing across the country. Rubik's Cube from ideal. 25 million Americans have made it a part of their lives. How about you?
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, the rest of the world. Sorry, the rest of the world. It was invented by a Hungarian, not an American. So, okay, so there it is. What do we know about it? Here's a cube. Invented in 1974. I mean, the number of possible solutions to the cube is staggering. 43 quintillion. It's just not worth even talking about. And the fact that we can solve it is remarkable. It has, and this is a clue to why it can be solved, it has a property that's called the God number. The God number is, if I give you a cube in the most scrambled state possible, and you know how to solve a cube, the worst that you will ever do is solve it in 20. Okay, that's called the God number. It's solved with what are called algorithms in the business. It's kind of an algorithm in computer science, but the community of cubers call them algorithms. And that means looking at the cube, as you all know, and look at corners and you say, well, that's there, I want to get it down to there. So I know that there's a series of, if you like, generators or transitions of the cube that will take me to my target. And there are many methods for speed cubing. I can talk about this actually ad infinitum. And I've been particularly interested, I'm not going to talk about it today, in blindfold cube solving. Because it's particularly interesting because it uses something called memory palaces, the method of loci, which is extraordinary in itself. But okay. I'm going to show you the current state of the art in cube solving, and this is going to just demoralize all of you. I used to have a slide that was from the British newspaper, and it said, you know, man solves cubed after 27 years of effort. You know, it compromised his marriage. And then you get this kid. And I'm going to show you what this is. So this is, for those who don't know, there are competitions. It's partly why it's interesting. It's like the Olympics. There's speed cubing. You go, you sit down, you get to inspect the cube. You can do this sighted or blindfolded, by the way. And once you feel comfortable, you don't manipulate it, you just look at it, you can then start the clock. Okay? And that's what he's going to do. He's going to break a record. Yeah, what everyone loves is this kid, right? Because he knows what it means, right? It's the rest of us like, yes, so? And so it's like, well, I mean, there's a few things to notice here. First of all, the average age. And they're just about 6 months younger than I am, most of them. And so, but that's another thing to discuss, why it is that people are so good at this young, and it's another thing. But so, let me just show you some data now. What you're looking at here is this blue line so this is years that we've had competitive cubing, and the blue line is the minimum number of steps required to solve the cube by the record holders. And you can see it's been getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and it converges on that number I mentioned to you, which is the God number. Okay, so it took us quite a long time to find it. This line is the time required to solve the cube. So that's the number of manipulations, and this is time in seconds. Okay? What you'll notice about these curves is kind of interesting. They're both exponentials. This, by the way, because I study this, I study the Math Olympiads as well and things like that. This is the only human performance task which shows exponential improvement outside of technology. There isn't one. If you look at the Olympics, if you look at math memorization, they're all linear. So this has a kind of Moore's law characteristic to it, which is really interesting. And so another thing you can do that's interesting is you can contrast human performance against computers that over the same period of time were trying to solve the cube, to find the God number. The God number has now been proved analytically, that is, you can mathematically show what it was, but for a very long time you had to do it by computer proof, which is approximate. And what's fascinating, actually, is how human beings and computers were more or less in lockstep for most of the history of the cube. So these are, you know, million-dollar computers at MIT, and these are 13-year-olds in clubs. Okay? And what do we need them for? It's my feeling. So, okay, we don't, is the answer to that, actually. So what you can do is something else. You can look at all the cubes. So I just showed you the 3 cube. But actually, there's a 4 by 4 by 4 cube, and a 5 by 5 by 5, and a 6 by 6 by 6, and a 7 by 7 by 7. And we can look at all of those curves. Here's the one. It looks compressed because relative to the other cubes, it's much quicker, right? But you can look at these curves, and they're kind of interesting. They're all improving. There's been competition for larger cubes for less time. That's hence fewer dots. But if you do a little mathematical manipulation on these curves, you discover something fascinating. Just look at these curves. We're going to slide them about. And we discover that they're all one curve. Every cube lies on one universal curve. And what makes that sort of fascinating is that the contemporary 3 by 3 was actually the 4 by 4 10 years ago, right? And it was the 5 by 5 15 years ago. Or, turning it around on its head, we can project this curve out into the future, and if we do that, we discover, right, by the year 2050, all cubes but one will be solved in the same amount of time. So we'll be watching videos, and that's, you don't believe me, well, we can come back in 2050, and you buy me a drink? And there are limits, of course, because, you know, just manipulation, and the God number is slightly different, but not by much, and we can estimate it. And so what's happened in these communities is they're highly skillful. They've learned algorithms, which they get from YouTube or from clubs, right, that make them, and I'm going to say this just out straight, it makes them smarter. It makes them smarter in solving the cube. When you learn calculus or English or poetry, composition at school, it made you smarter. I do not believe in this absurdity that there's a genetic determinant, right? That's the smart bit, and everything above it is some kind of icing. The cake is genetic. That is not true. And I want to claim that actually we've got that totally wrong. I'm not saying there aren't differences that aren't interesting, but actually intelligence for me is the acquisition of algorithms that you can use to perfect your skills. And expertise is a measure of the number of algorithms that you get to store. Okay? The fact that you're given shit algorithms by teachers is not your fault, right? And I think that's actually something that we should understand, that, you know, we should be rethinking the kind of algorithms we distribute. So there's a kind of revolution in pedagogy out there in terms of how we get smarter this way. So why is this true? Aha! I mean, this is my kind of, we're getting there. Why is this universal? And you'll recognize this from, hopefully, at some point, This is a picture from Plato's Republic, Book 7. And you will know it. This is the story that what the reality that we think is real is just shadows projected from a reality that we don't see. And for Plato, the reality that we don't see is mathematical reality. Okay? And what is the reality that the Rubik cube is a shadow of? Okay? So here it is. So this is, well, okay, let me tell you this quickly first. So this is a picture from a book by Roger Penrose, the physicist Roger Penrose. He makes that there's a physical world, right? There's a mental representation of the physical world, right? That mental world creates an abstract world of mathematics, which is then used to represent the physical world. For Platonists, the Platonic mathematical world, the world of form, comes first. For psychologists, like my friend at the back of the room, mental world comes first. For physicists, physics, that comes first. This is a kind of Ouroboros of reality, and it's not clear, we just had a meeting on this, which one gets priority. But in that world, I'm now going to show you the Platonic ideal, the form of which the Rubik's cube is a manifestation. That's the cube. That's a tiny bit of it. I'm going to show you a bigger bit of it, hopefully. There. In there, let's look inside of it. Inside of that. This massive graph is called a Cayley graph. This is isomorphic to the physical object that you consider a children's puzzle. Okay? This is the mathematical structure that 7-year-olds are learning, and are learning to traverse with extraordinary facility that is parallel to the facility of mathematicians writing giant computer code. So when you solve a Rubik's cube, you're solving a problem in mathematics which is not yet solved. Right? The diameter of the Cayley graph, the God number, is not analytically been yet calculated for anything other than the 3 by 3. We can actually project what the mathematical solution to this problem is by studying 13-year-olds in clubs. We don't need to use computer models. Right? We get it through a puzzle. And the reason it works is for this reason, and see if we can get it to work. This is what a bit of that graph looks like, that Platonic absolute form that the cube is a manifestation of. And they actually map 1 to 1. They're identical, actually. And when you solve the cube, what you're doing is you're moving over this Cayley graph. And what algorithms do that you're learning is they're teaching you how to navigate from any given position in the cube to any given target. That's what it means to solve a cube. So it allows us to do things like this. So there's a 6-year-old girl solving the Rubik's cube blindfolded. If you'd shown this to Rubik in 1974, he'd just fallen over and died. Right? Because he was like, my whole life's work's just a bloody waste of time. This is a trivial puzzle. It's trivial for her. Because she's super smart at it. So, okay, quickly, because I know I have time. So, how not to be stupid about intelligence? Okay, so here's a few things I think we should learn about. So first of all, what is intelligence? Right? Learning algorithms, that is expertise, to solve problems efficiently, skill, right? And in some cases, extract generalities, theory building. That's the Feynman story. Okay? I want you to notice right away here, this is not about mathematics. This could be true of sport, it could be true of ballet, it could be true of music. The nervous system does not care. Right? You have more neurons to move than you have to think. Right? I like to say that the reason why we're bad at mathematics is because natural selection doesn't give a shit about mathematics. Right? But it does care that you can move. It's hard because we don't have enough brain cells. You have more to move and to see. So, okay, so intelligence is not about analytical reasoning. It's about a much more generic set of properties that we could call algorithms, skills, expertise, and theory building. not all of those algorithms are consciously available to you, right? When kids are solving the cube, they don't necessarily know. You know, most of us here who do mathematics, at a certain point it becomes automatic. I couldn't tell you why this particular operation on an equation works. I'd have to go back to the original derivation. I've just acquired an algorithm. And that's the great secret, right, of having a facility in anything, is that you don't think about it, right? Great tennis players don't think when they're responding to a serve, what should I do? If they think about it, they're going to lose. And so actually, weirdly enough, the more intelligent you are, the less you have to think. Now, that's the second important point. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of obvious. If you ask someone a question, they go, say, oops. Okay, but when they sort of do that, it's like, wow, that's interesting. Second point. Third, limitations of any observer-dependent exam. Right? So exams are problematic for all the reasons I mentioned. And for me, in the age of ChatGPT and Llama and all these things, I think for humans to stand out, in particular, we have to start focusing more and more on unification and synthesis, not performance, right? No one says that, you know, a car runs faster than a human being, right? If they did, you'd walk away from them, right? You say a car is faster than a human being, but human beings run faster than cars, okay? The fact that we use the word think for what ChatGPT does and what we do is a problem, okay? It will always be faster at something, right? But it's not a challenge. You don't put Ferraris in a 100-meter Olympic event. It just would be silly, okay? And I think we're making exactly that mistake over and over and over again. It's because the language is limited, so we apply the same terms to two phenomena which are not comparable. So, what is this final slide? This! Yes, that's Mary Curie, and incontestably one of the great geniuses of the world, 2 Nobel Prizes, talking to an ant, learning from an ant. I want to claim that the challenge that we face, and it's sort of more than obvious in the world that we're living in, that unless we actually start developing a new science, an understanding of collective intelligence, we're fucked. So, thank you very much. Thank you.